You have tuned into The Voice of Medicine, the medical podcast filled with remarkable stories, first-hand experience, important research, and valuable life lessons. Open your mind, relax, and enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of The Voice of Medicine. Today I am interviewing an amazing person from the US, Dr. Alan Goldberg. Dr. Goldberg is a sports performance consultant and he's internationally known expert in the peak sports performance. Dr. Goldberg works with athletes and teams across all sports and in every possible level. He helped Olympic caliber athletes and also till this very day junior competitors. He does one-on-one coaching sessions with athletes worldwide. We will discuss today the importance of mental training, focus, and other methods that athletes can use to help their performance. I believe that this is something very important for our medical doctors listening out there as well, since they are daily in situations of high performance situations and where high performances are required from them. So maybe they can learn something from the world of athletes just as much. Enjoy the podcast. Dr. Goldberg, welcome to the podcast, The Voice of Medicine.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Dr. Goldberg, so you have worked with professional athletes all, in your career. I believe that when you're a professional athlete and sports that you compete in on day-to-day basis is your living, at a certain point, probably the additional physical training does not make any difference anymore, but the mental stuff does. So, and that's where you come into the game. Can you tell us about the mental part of sports?
Yeah, well, it's not just professional athletes. I do work with professional and some Olympic athletes. The vast majority of athletes I work with are anywhere from 9 and up. I work with junior athletes and I work with high school and college age athletes as well as adults. And I would be saying the same thing for them that I would be saying for professional athletes. That the way I think about it is in training, you could break down the importance of the physical and the mental in this way. In training, maybe 95% of your success is the physical training, building up a training base, having good mechanics, developing the muscle memory. Then when you go to compete, my feeling is whether you do well or you don't, whether you perform to your potential or struggle, it's all mental. Okay. And the physical is no longer involved. And I say that because you have the muscle memory and you have the training base. And whether you perform to your potential or not really has to do a lot with how focused you are. Are you focused on the right things? Are you able to, is your nervous system at a lower level of activation so you're in what I call good nervous, or are you too nervous? Because it's the mental side that knocks athletes for a loop and causes performance problems, which is really kind of my specialty in terms of working with those issues. So it's important at every level once you get ready to compete.
Okay, so as soon as you're in some sort of competition, you don't need to be a professional. People can work with you.
Oh, well, anybody like me. Absolutely.
Okay.
Right. One of the reasons I say that is I work across all sports, and there's a repetition of the same kind of performance problems. And I run into a lot of common ones. And one of them is people do better in practice than they do in competition, which is, one would say, well, that's obvious because there's more pressure when you go to compete. And when you're practicing, who cares if you mess up? But a lot of that is related to what goes on, in terms of the athlete's head. In practice, athletes inadvertently, they're not aware of it, they're focusing on all the right things. They go into a competition and they change everything because they tell themselves, now it counts. I can't make mistakes. So instead of paying attention to the right things, they're focusing more on what's going on in their head. They're focusing more on their thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll definitely go into the topic a little bit deeper. But what I wanted to start is, so let's say an athlete, doesn't matter, how old or professional or not, comes to you for the first time and says, Dr. Goldberg, I have an important competition coming up in 2-3 months. What do you do? Where do you start? What's the process?
The first step that I take with athletes is there's two things. First of all, I obviously need to understand how their performance problem works. I'm assuming if they're coming to me, most of the time they have specific performance problems, or maybe they want to cover all their bases and be mentally tough. But the first thing I start with is I want to know what their current mental strategies are right now. And again, when I say that, people don't consciously have mental strategies necessarily. I mean, some do if they've really worked on this dimension. But most of the time they're not aware of it. So what I'll be doing with them is I'll have them teach me when they're performing at their best, what's going on mentally. Like, what are they thinking about before the performance? What are they focusing on? What part of the brain are they in? How activated is their nervous system? Are they in good nervous, or are they way up here in bad nervous? And then I will do the same thing with bad performances. I want to know what's different when you're not at your best, when you struggle. What are you doing differently, pre-performance and during performance? Because for a lot of athletes, they screw up before the performance starts. In other words, I do a lot of work internationally with swimmers, and I say this to swimmers all the time. Races are won and lost before the start, because it has to do with what are you focusing on? How nervous are you? Are you able to handle last-minute negative thinking and doubts? All of that stuff. And a lot of athletes are not aware of what they're doing differently when they're at their best and when they struggle. So that first step is, for myself, helping me figure out what they're doing differently in those two situations. But also the purpose of that is I want to foster awareness within the athlete. Because in anything we do, awareness is the foundation of change. If you're not aware of what you're doing wrong, you're doomed to keep repeating it. So as we go through this initial part where I'm helping them understand the difference between their best performances and worse ones, I'm also beginning to instill the sense of awareness, in them. And then I go after, I guess you could say the next step is I want to find out what they're doing differently concentration-wise. I want to find out how activated their nervous system is. Okay. Are they at a lower level of activation where they're more excited about the performance and it will enhance their performances? Or are they so activated that they're starting to experience a sense of danger and either that fight, flight, and then the other? So what are they focusing on? How activated they are? And the other thing I go after is, like, what part of the brain are they in? And what I mean by that is, our brain is divided, again, grossly, into 3 parts: front brain, midbrain, hindbrain. Each part of the brain controls different functioning in our lives, in and out of our sport. And our front brain's job is thinking. Okay, so anytime we go into a performance or in the middle of a performance and we're evaluating ourselves, we're criticizing ourselves after a mistake, we're hanging on to it, we're worried about what other people might think, what the coach is thinking, then we are in our front brain, because our front brain's job is thinking. Midbrain controls emotions, and our hindbrain controls what we call knowing, which is the knowing that comes from doing something over and over and over again. And when you look at good performance and bad performance, people who struggle performance-wise, either before and during the performance, and people who do well, they're in different parts of the brain. So athletes who struggle are more in their head. And athletes who perform well, their focus is either on the action, depending on the sport, okay, or they're focusing on the feel of what they're doing. So one of the other pieces I go after is to try to teach athletes an awareness of the part of their brain that they're in, whether they're in their front brain or hind brain, and then how to, if they are in their front brain, how to get to your hind brain. And that ties in with concentration, because basically the way we get out of our front brain is by learning to put our focus either in our body. So if I'm a swimmer, I would be focusing on feel, okay, not my thoughts. When I'm racing, I want to stay long, or I want to be pulling a lot of water, or a gymnast or a diver. There's a lot of sports that are very much feel related. So to do well, I have to have my focus there. Then there are more ball sports, baseball, softball, football, European football, tennis, where your focus needs to be external on the action, on what I call seeing, reading, and reacting. So you see what's going on, you instinctively read it, and you react. Involves no thinking and takes a nanosecond. Happens instinctively. But, athletes that get into trouble, they're not in their body. They're dissociated. They're in their head thinking about stuff.
I think what would maybe be a little more of a help is perhaps a short example of an athlete. Of course, no names, anything, but something that happened to you a lot in your experience with the particular problem, and how you actually managed to change it.
All right. So there's a kid I'm working with right now who is a very talented baseball player, 15 or 16, has the potential to certainly play in college at a Division I level, at the highest level, and has been struggling for the last year and a half, 2 years with throwing problems. Cannot control his throw. And it doesn't happen in the middle of a performance. It happens when there's a break in the action and they have to throw the ball around after an out or something like that. And a lot of performance problems have a trauma base to them. What I mean by that, the trauma can be physical. He could have had an arm injury or a leg injury, or they could be emotional, and he could be having been abused by a coach, or being humiliated by a teammate or something like that. And we have a tendency to memorize that stuff. But in this example, the only reason I'm bringing that up is a lot of these kinds of performance problems have that trauma base. But with somebody like that, again, what I wanted to do, first of all, is I wanted to find out, it was pretty obvious to me what part of the brain he was going to be in, but I needed to help him understand that. So we kind of talked about that. And what he would be doing before he threw is worrying about, I'm going to spike the ball, I'm going to throw it over somebody's head. What are people going to say? This is embarrassing. I'm supposed to be this really good player. College coaches aren't going to be looking at me. And he'd be having his focus on these thoughts, which was driving his nervous system up into the danger zone. So whenever he would go to play, his nervous system was basically experiencing danger. And obviously there's no physical danger we're talking about, but for us as mammals, we'd like to believe that our incredible thinking brain controls behavior. No, our biology controls behavior. When push comes to shove and we experience anything that feels like danger, we're going to automatically click. Our nervous system is going to rev up. Heart rate goes up, breathing gets faster and shallower, muscles tighten, mind begins to race. And we're going to automatically at some point click into a self-protective motor program, either fight or flight. The problem for a lot of athletes, though, in their performances is you're experiencing danger, but you can't protect yourself by fighting or fleeing. If this kid was on the mound getting ready to pitch or up at the plate, he couldn't protect himself. He's getting ready to throw. He was feeling danger and unable to escape from it. And there's a third default survival option in those situations, which is called the freeze or immobility response. When we're in danger and we can't protect ourselves, we shut down. I don't know if you've heard this expression, and I don't know if it's American, but deer in the headlights.
Yeah, sure. We know that. Yeah.
And basically, it's not a good coping strategy, but you freeze. And what happens for athletes is they literally lose control of their body. They lose feel, they can't control it. And a lot of performance problems are from an athlete stuck in that. So with a kid like this, I want to know, and I want to help him understand what he's doing wrong mentally, what he's focusing on, what the part of the brain he's in, that he's in his front brain. And then to teach him in very small steps how to get out of his front brain, but also in these situations, how to lower his nervous system activation. Okay, because if you don't, I could teach somebody relaxation techniques and I can teach them how to concentrate, but if they don't pay attention to the signs that their nervous system's getting activated, all their skills, whether they're physical or mental, go offline. So with a situation like this, I'm going to spend a little bit more time directly working with the kid's nervous system and teaching them to recognize when they're getting activated and how to identify the signs of it, and then how to settle their nervous system. And that is a foundation skill for anybody who has any kind of block that's trauma-based, whether it's a physical trauma. Like a lot of kids who have injuries and they come back and they're not the same after the injury, or kids who've been emotionally abused by coaches or humiliated, So is that clear enough in terms of what I do?
Yeah, I think I'm getting it. It's the basis that you teach people how to detect when their stress level is getting to a point where they're losing the control over their body and their performance. And then you teach them techniques how to get again to a good level of let's say a positive excitement, so they can basically go on performing.
Yeah, that's good. That's pretty accurate. Yeah, I'm using different lenses to work, to look at problems and to work with them. And almost the way I look at it is I'm working on two levels. Most people who do sports psychology and mental training work on the surface level. They work with, you come to me and you're too nervous. And so the surface is, I'm going to teach you some conscious strategies. I'm going to teach you how to relax. And if you have negative thinking, I'll teach you how to stop it. And I'll teach you how to use positive thoughts. And I'll teach you imagery. And those skills are fine. They're useful for any athlete to have in their mental toughness toolbox. But if that's all you do, you're going to be limited in your effectiveness, because a lot of those conscious skills athletes can't use if their nervous system is already too revved up. Okay, because again, one of the things that happens is if I'm too activated, my trained skills go offline. I cannot perform the way I know I can because my nervous system has determined this situation's unsafe. There's no logic here. This is all biology. And it used to be that I would just work on the surface in the early part of my career. And, I had some success, but there were a lot of athletes I couldn't do work with. I wasn't effective. Gymnasts, divers, equestrians, athletes who are in sports where there's an element of danger and the opportunity to get hurt in daily practice, not just in competition. And, working with them was frustrating for me because I knew I was missing something. I'd be teaching them all this other stuff and it would help a little bit, and then they would immediately go back.
So it really, from everything you said, it really depends on what sport the particular athlete is active in. Your approach has to be completely different. This actually would be my next question: is how different is it if you have somebody who is competing in a sport where he's a part of or she is a part of a team and if he's a loner.
A loner.
Yeah, well, like a tennis player who just plays alone, or a boxer who just fights alone. So the difference between somebody who needs to be integrated into a team and somebody who basically plays for himself. It's not a team sport.
Well, there in many ways a lot of that is the same. There's different dynamics, clearly. If you're playing tennis or you're swimming and you're a gymnast, yeah, you're part of a team, but you're really performing on your own. Although tennis players aren't usually part of a team. But really, even an athlete in a team sport, they still have a job individually to do. And when they struggle with performance problems, it would be like a tennis player struggling. I mean, there's more dynamics that go on a team that can complicate things or make them easier. Like if you have supportive teammates and teammates who are, it's a safe environment, and you have a coach who understands on a team that what's critical is you create this safe container for your players. So it can be more complicated if you have a coach or teammates who aren't kind, and meaning and that sort of thing. It can make the problem worse. But I don't see a different approach, because even the team player is coming to me because they're having individual problems. They're not performing the way they're supposed to. They're not passing the way they should when they're, like I have there's a field hockey player I'm working with who against better teams does great. One of the better players on her team, incidentally. And when she plays weaker teams, she falls apart, which makes no sense on some level, except with better teams, she basically she doesn't think, doesn't care, just goes out and does her thing, and therefore is more in her hindbrain and more focused on the action and not evaluating everything she does. When she plays against weaker teams, the game is much slower. She's pressuring herself because she's one of the better players on the team to carry the team. She's focusing more on outcome, like I need to score, I need to get points, I need to get some assists, I need to get my teammates in on the action. And because she's doing that, she's so much in her head, in her front brain, that she's not paying attention to the action and is not reacting quickly. And then it gets compounded because her coach at that moment begins to yell at her because she's not doing what she's supposed to do.
You mentioned in the very beginning in the talk that a lot of people perform much better during practice. I wanted to ask, well, there is different type of practice. And one of the things which I keep hearing is the difference between simply just practicing and then the so-called deliberate practice, where you are extremely focused on what you're doing. So some people even would say, well, you shouldn't, for example, listen to music while you do something, because that's also a something distracting in the process. So can you maybe tell us more about deliberate practicing?
Okay. Yeah, practice is key, obviously. And you need to there's something called state-bound learning, okay? One of the reasons you see people perform better in practice than they do in competition is because practice is a different emotional state. There's no pressure. There's nothing at stake. I don't worry about making mistakes. I can relax. And the problem is when I then go to compete, the emotional state of competition is much different than practice. So deliberate practice, I kind of think of like perfect practice. And perfect practice is where you are duplicating elements of, as best you can, obviously, you're duplicating elements in the competition that in practice, that you're going to run into in the competition. There was a guy I talked to years ago who had swam across all of the major Great Lakes in the United States. And he's an interesting guy. He had a near drowning when he was like 5 years old and was phobic of the water until he was 33, avoided it like the plague, and decided he wanted to get over it at that point. But the way he practiced for his first crossing, which was in Lake Michigan, which I think was 53 miles from the Wisconsin shore to Michigan shore. The way he practiced was he looked at the elements that he knew he was going to have to face in the actual crossing, in the competition, so to speak. And that would be, so he'd have to swim when he was tired, and he'd have to swim at night. So what he did in preparation for that was he would stay up all night and then all of the next day. And then that night, he would go out and swim loops. Now, he obviously, when people do open water swimming, they don't go out alone. They may be crazy, but they're not stupid, if you know what I mean. And then he also knew that, he'd have to deal with very cold lake water. And people who are swimming in that kind of water anyway use wetsuits. But he would practice going out in very cold water. And also, when you're doing open water swimming, you have to deal with waves. So he would wait for, these minor storms where the waves were 6-7 feet, and go out with the support boat and do these 7-mile loops. So, and any kind of practice, if you want to get anything out of it, whether it's perfect practice as I'm describing or deliberate like you're talking about, you have to be mentally present. You can't just go through the motions. If you're, in swimming, there's an expression called garbage yardage. In other words, you're in the pool, you look like a swimmer, you've got the strokes, there's the turns and all that stuff, but the lights are on and no one's home. You're out to lunch. You're not present. And I don't think it helps anyone in their training if they're mentally somewhere else. And, my feeling is one of the foundations of mental toughness is concentration. If you're in practice and you're letting your focus go all over the place, when you go to compete, same thing's going to happen.
If focus and concentration is so paramount, how do you get yourself to a place where you can control it so well that you just say, okay, switch it on, now you're concentrated for whatever amount of minutes?
Okay. Well, concentration is a learned skill. But believe it or not, the purpose isn't, if I teach you how to focus, my expectation is not that you'll never lose your focus. The way we learn to concentrate is by catching ourselves when we drift and quickly and gently bringing our focus back. So concentration is what we call a recognize and return skill. I want to be aware the instant my focus leaves, and I want to reset. A break in concentration is not going to hurt an athlete. It won't make them anxious. It won't undermine their confidence. What's going to hurt an athlete is they lose their focus and they stay there. They don't come back right away. Okay. And then, there are a lot of athletes who have attention problems, attention deficit disorder, ADD, whatever. So it's not an issue if you drift. It is an issue if you drift and you stay there. So, in teaching people that skill, and it is a skill you can learn, it's really a question of heightening an athlete's awareness when they've lost their focus, and then the discipline of coming back. And part of that is training people, and this is sort of where my thinking has changed a whole lot over the last, 15 years. I mentioned before, I used to talk about helping athletes stay positive, okay, because everybody thinks you got to be positive. And the issue is, I can teach an athlete thought-stopping techniques. I can teach them how to block their negative thoughts out. And we can work on it and they can practice it. And that does not mean months later, when they're in the middle of a big competition, and that negative thinking won't come up again, because it will. And the last thing I want people doing when they're either about to compete or competing is they've got negative thoughts on one shoulder and they have positive thoughts on the other. No, it's okay. I've been practicing really well. I'm going to do fine today. No, you're not. You're going to choke. Look at all those people watching. What are they going to think? No, you'll be fine. See, the problem with that, when athletes do that, they're in their front brain. They're thinking, and they're dissociated. They're not in the performance. So one of the other skills around concentration is teaching athletes, when thoughts come up, how to let them go and how not to engage them. Most of us, when we hear negative thoughts or outcome related thoughts, we think it's the voice of God speaking to us, predicting the future. And it's just brainwave activity. It's normal. Every athlete, and I've worked with Olympic athletes who've won medals, and that does not make them immune to not having negative thoughts. Everybody does. It's part of the human condition. The issue isn't the thoughts. The issue is, how do you respond to them? And what I teach athletes is when a negative thought goes, so I'm focusing on what we're doing. Negative thought goes by, what you can train yourself to do is let it go. What most people do, a negative thought goes by and they follow it and they engage it and they bring it down, and before they know, they're screwed.
So instead of catching those thoughts passing by and starting discussing them for yourself inside with pro and con, you just let them pass, refocus again on what you're doing, and everything should be okay.
In order to do that, though, you have to have something to refocus on. It's one thing to tell yourself, okay, a negative thought goes by, I'm just going to let it go. You have to have something else that you use to distract yourself from the negative thoughts. And for a lot of athletes, that would be their pre-performance routine. Okay. I do a lot of work with competitive shooters also. And, whether we're talking about skeet or a rifle or pistol, they all have shot plans. Okay. And the reason we have pre-performance rituals, they're things that we do. And you'll see, like they could be pre-game rituals, they could be certain warm-up rituals. Those things provide us with something concrete that I can put my focus on. So when the negative thoughts start, I'm more interested in what I'm doing right now. So if let's say, before I perform, I have a certain stretching ritual. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to make sure I'm focusing on the feeling of the stretch. And maybe, let's say my ritual is I do my upper body before my lower body. I do my left side before my right. I'm going to get absorbed in the stretching. There's a right way of doing a ritual. And this is sort of goes back to your comment about deliberate practice and a wrong way to do a ritual. And it has nothing to do with what you're doing. It does not have to do with whether you stretch or listen to music. It has to do with where your focus is as you do the ritual. The right way of doing a ritual is when I'm stretching and I'm pulling my left arm across my body, I am focusing on the feel of that stretch. I'm even breathing into the stretch. Mm-hmm. The wrong way of doing it is while I'm pulling my left arm across my body, I'm thinking, oh my God, what if I choke? Remember what happened 2 weeks ago? What if it happens again? What are people going to think? And I'm in my head and I'm not present. I'm not focused on what I'm doing. I'm focusing on my thoughts.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I read it maybe in some kind of a newspaper or a magazine that athletes do this visualizations techniques when they, already see themselves on the podium winning the medal before they even actually went to the competition. So is this a myth or is there something to it?
Oh, there's a lot to it. But I think, first of all, imagery, visualization, mental rehearsal, as far as I'm concerned, some people will say, oh, they're all different. No, it's all the same. You mentally practice going through a performance. But see, the most effective imagery is you don't just see yourself on the podium raising your fist, holding the trophy up. It's the process that's important. So, like if you have a tendency to get too nervous before a performance, it might be useful, besides you learning relaxation techniques, it might be useful for you way before the performance happens, that you see yourself getting ready for the race or getting ready for the game and staying calm and staying focused. So you mentally practice that. The idea behind imagery working is when it's vivid. Mm-hmm. By vivid is you're using all of your senses: sight, hearing, feel, even smell. The more vivid it is and lifelike, the more opportunity it is to get into your system. Okay, because vivid imagery kind of gets encoded as if it were actual experience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how true it is or not, but what I've read over and over again is the brain can't tell the difference between what's vividly imagined and what's real. And as evidence for that, when we wake up in the middle of the night from, say, a scary dream,
Mm-hmm.
our heart rate's pounding, we're breathing fast and shallow, and we're hypervigilant, we're freaked out. And, imagery, you're controlling it more if you're using it the right way. And there's a lot to it, but the problem is it's not a skill where you go one size fits all. I'm going to take everybody on the team, I'm going to teach them imagery, because some people, it doesn't work for them.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, it does, and it's a learned skill. You'll get better at it. But also there's a timing issue here. And what I mean by that is this is an individual part of it as well. There are some people, so there was a swimmer I worked with years ago who, ever since he was 12, started doing imagery and got so good at it that he could get within 1 2/10 of a second when he would do his races. Shorter races, obviously. You're not going to do this if you're swimming a mile because you'd bore yourself into a sleep state. But he found if he tried to do imagery closer than an hour to his race, less than an hour before, it made him more anxious. And I know a lot of athletes, they can't even do it the day of the performance. They need to stop the night before, 2 nights before, even a week before. So it's a very powerful skill. And I think very important skill, but it really, you got to figure out what works for you first.
Dr. Goldberg, last question of our podcast. Is there something in your toolbox and, after all the experience and work that you have done that you could recommend to non-athletes, which would perhaps help them with their daily performances?
Probably I'd go back to the concentration thing because we're performers in everything we do. Okay. If we have to get up in front of a group to speak, if we have to take a test, if we have to, even social interaction depends on the individual, you're a performing artist, whatever. Concentration makes the world go round performance-wise. So probably the most important skill is to learn how to stay focused on what's important. And what's important, real quickly is staying in the now, staying in the moment, and keeping your focus on what you're doing. So if I get up in front of an audience to play, I'm a concert pianist, and I see in the front row the music critics, and I'm starting to think about what they're thinking about me, my focus obviously is in the wrong place. I'm not in the music. I'm not focusing on what I'm doing. I'm not connected to the feel of the piece. I am thinking. So, I think across any performance arena, whether you're an athlete or you're not, you want to learn how to be aware of keeping your focus in the now, keeping your focus on what you're doing. And that third thing I mentioned, when you drift, learning to train yourself, the discipline to bring yourself back.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the advice. I'm pretty sure it's going to help also our listeners, of which a lot of are doctors. So maybe getting back, their focus during surgery might help.
Well, that, you want to talk about a pressured performance?
Yeah.
That's a pressured performance.
Right there.
and that's a hindbrain performance. When they're at their best, they're not questioning, doubting, obsessing. They're just doing.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that would be useful.
Dr. Goldberg, thank you very much again for taking your time. It was a pleasure.
It's well here. Good to see you. All right. You take care.
This was The Voice of Medicine. Make sure you tune in next time and take care.